Hello, my name is William Parker. I'm here today to talk to you about acetaminophen and its connection with neuropsychiatric disorders and possibly autism. There's been a lot of confusion on the web and the literature to an extent, although the literature is pretty clear. The scientific literature is very clear, that is. We'll go over the scientific literature. It's not a formal science lecture. This is more of an explanation, a little bit informal, just to let the average person know what's going on with this acetaminophen connection. And I'd like to point out that acetaminophen is also known as paracetamol. In most countries outside the United States, it's known as paracetamol or some derivative of paracetamol, such as paracetamol. What I'll be talking about and summarizing today is a review that we published recently, back in March of 2017, just a few months ago. It's a collaboration between myself and several faculty members at Duke and at Harvard University, as well as Cynthia Nevison, who works at Colorado. We got together and put together a review on acetaminophen and its effects on the child's developing brain. It can be development in utero during pregnancy, as well as development during childhood, say from birth to age about 5 or 6. It's called a critical review because we're examining multiple lines of evidence, not necessarily just certain kinds of studies, but all different kinds of studies, trying to put together the picture of what's going on. It is peer-reviewed, which means that we had other scientists look at it, editors gave it to other scientists who reviewed it. Once it passed the review process, then it was published. It is open access, so you can find the reference here online. You can print it out, you can copy it, you can reproduce it without any restriction. The rules of the review are that we basically examine all the available evidence. You don't leave anything out. You look at different kinds of evidence, and you determine how strong or weak is the evidence. And I'll go through different kinds of evidence with you today. I'll also be very careful, I think, to point out the difference between what our opinion is versus what the facts are of the situation. We're going to be looking at essentially 12 different independent lines of evidence. And the first line of evidence is a string of studies. And because this is not a formal scientific lecture, I'm not going to go through each one of these studies, but these are different studies looking at what happens when people take acetaminophen either during early childhood or during pregnancy. Now, each one of these studies is controlled, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit, but the important thing is that some of these are published in very prestigious journals. The first one was published back in 2008, almost 10 years ago, and it took a while for that to be followed up on. Most of the studies that are coming out are very recent, so that may be a reason why a lot of people haven't heard much about this. The studies are, as I said before, they're controlled for all different kinds of things. Most importantly, they're controlled for typically controlled for the reasons for taking acetaminophen. Right, so people typically take acetaminophen or paracetamol because they feel ill. There's something wrong. They have a cold, they have pains, they have aches, so they take acetaminophen. When people are doing these studies that I mentioned on the previous page, they control for that as well as other kinds of things: gender, smoking, age, a wide variety of factors depending on the study. And every single one of those 12 studies, and I'll note the point 1 over here. This is the first line of evidence. The first line of evidence that something is wrong with acetaminophen in the developing brain is 12 different studies looking at the effects in humans that are controlled for all kinds of different factors, depending on the study, depending on the number of people they had in the study and how the study was conducted. Now, not one study has found that acetaminophen is safe for the developing brain. In other words, all of the studies found something wrong associated with use of acetaminophen, and again, in every case, it seems to be specific for the acetaminophen. So it's not the reason why they took the acetaminophen. If they took ibuprofen, for example, it didn't have the same effect. The problems include lowered IQ, behavioral problems, specifically social problems, as well as in a couple of the studies that looked at it, autism. And autism, I think, is one of the most frightening aspects of this problem. I'll focus a lot on the autism issue during this talk, but it's not just autism per se, it's a number of different kinds of what we call neurodevelopmental disorders, which means something is going wrong during development, causing problems that can last a lifetime. If you look on the web, you'll see that a lot of the studies are criticized. You'll go on to say the National Health Service for the UK, and they'll criticize a certain study. Well, it had this weakness or that weakness. And anytime you read these criticisms, they tend to suffer from a few key weaknesses. And it's interesting how consistent the criticisms of these studies are. So one of the key weaknesses is they rely on experts who do not know the peer-reviewed literature. If you look on the web, you'll see that some of the same experts continually say, hey, acetaminophen is safe, there's nothing to worry about. Because I'm a professor at Duke University, I can get some of these folks to respond to me and contact them and show them some of the information I'm showing you today on this YouTube video. And what we find is that none of those experts who are quoted they won't stick with their claim. They won't stick with their claim that acetaminophen is safe once they see the preponderance of evidence that I'll show you today. And again, I'm not cherry picking the evidence. I don't have any commercial interest in this, and I don't have any conflict of interest. My interest is simply in explaining our review and explaining the information and misinformation that's surrounding this topic. So I've contacted several of these individuals. I've contacted all of them I could find, and again, none of them will back up their claim. And one of them told me, hey, I was interviewed as a clinician, which means that I was just asked about what do I do in my practice. So in practice, yes, acetaminophen is the most commonly used drug today for children, but that does not mean it's safe, as indicated by those 12 studies and 11 more factors that I am going to give you that are independent from those 12 studies. So again, those 12 studies are factor number 1. All right. When people are criticizing the studies, again, like those experts, they don't usually realize that there's a number of different studies out there that are checked for what we call confounding factors, or in other words, the reason people took the acetaminophen. And they don't recognize that there's more than one study. I also see the assumption, and this was an assumption that was made in published criticism of the very first paper, the 2008 paper that was published in the journal Autism by Stephen Schultz. And the assumption is that because everybody's doing it, then it must be safe. Now, this is a logical fallacy. Those of you familiar with the history of modern medicine will know that this is absolutely positively false. There's no reason for this to be true, and if history is any indication, there is good reason to suspect that this is probably not true in all cases. So the second reason that we're looking at acetaminophen suspiciously when it comes to neurodevelopmental disorders, particularly autism, is that plausible mechanisms have been proposed. Now, in terms of evidence, this is what we would consider very weak evidence. It's not strong evidence, but it's kind of necessary evidence. In other words, if there's no plausible mechanism, then we tend to disfavor the hypothesis. But in this case, and I'll continue to show you references, but I won't go into details about these mechanisms. This one mentions glutathione depletion and endocannabinoid system activation. These all have to do with inflammation in the brain and alteration of neural development. There's also a lot of issues with an inhibition of prostaglandin synthesis. Again, we won't go into any of that. There's some other YouTube videos that discuss those particular issues in detail. If you're more interested in the science of this, you can look up these papers here. This last paper here is looking at how acetaminophen affects specifically male brains more than female brains. That's very interesting. Margaret McCarthy at the University of Maryland did that work, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But in general, there are very plausible mechanisms. Weak evidence, but necessary evidence. Another line of weak evidence that we have, but it's also necessary, is that if you look at, and this is Cynthia Nevinson's work here, if you look at the rise in autism, about 1980, it really takes off. Okay, now in 1980 is when aspirin use was associated with Reye's syndrome. That's when there was a big paradigm shift in clinical practice, switching from aspirin to acetaminophen or paracetamol. And of course, the numbers have been going up since then. Cindy tells me that the numbers are still going up. So the timelines are associated. Now again, timeline association is weak evidence, but if the timelines weren't associated, we would not favor this hypothesis very strongly. So it's necessary to look at this kind of information to see if this is panning out. Does this make sense? And in this case, yes, it does make sense. It's certainly not proof, but it is one line of circumstantial evidence. And without this line of circumstantial evidence, we probably wouldn't be making this video today. Another very interesting line of evidence was published by Bernard Rimland. Back in the early days, in the 70s, the incidence of autism was thought to be very low. There wasn't much interest in it, so there were a couple of private agencies looking at it. And what they found was, this is a survey type, it's a survey that they did of parents who had children with autism, and they found that about 1980, something shifted. And what happened is the type of autism changed from infantile to more regressive. In other words, it changed from a kind of autism that could be observed very early on in development versus kind of autism which seemed to kick in later during development. And this is consistent with the rising use of acetaminophen during this time frame. So the acetaminophen is being used and causing a certain type of autism, which I'll get into. We'll put the data together a little bit more later. We think the acetaminophen effect is more in children than it is in utero in the fetus during pregnancy. But yet again, this is another line of evidence, and the data, the tracking of incidence here is independent of the tracking that I showed you from Cindy's work earlier on. So this is a fourth line of evidence, is this shift in the type of autism that occurred about 1980. Now, this is a very suspicious line of evidence, is what does acetaminophen do to the adult brain? Well, it does actually, and it's intended to shut down the function of the hypothalamus. That's a part of the brain. It's a little bit unnerving to know that we've decided to use a drug extensively in very small children, which has this kind of profound effect on brain function. But it does do that. But in addition to that, it also has these unintended effects. And here's the references for those. It basically blunts social responses, and it can lower IQ temporarily in adults. These are akin to the kinds of effects that in evidence number one I showed you. There's certain effects that seem to be long-term associated with acetaminophen, but not for the reason for using acetaminophen, and they're very related apparently to the type of effects that you see in adults. All right, and you can see that some of these papers are fairly new, 2015, 2016. These kinds of things just haven't been looked at very much until very recently. Acetaminophen is a very old drug, going back to the 1800s. It was grandfathered in. As you can see now from the evidence I'm showing you, if it was a modern drug, it never would have made it into humans, but being grandfathered in, it bypassed the current system that we have for drug approval. A sixth line of evidence, and I think a very important line of evidence, is just the answer to the question, what happens when you give acetaminophen to the developing brain of laboratory animals? And these are independent labs that have done this, one on mice, one on rats. And what you see is there's long-term effects on brain function in these animals. And in general, they're related to social function. So it can be similar to what's going on with autism. An independent line of evidence is published by Margaret McCarthy in her lab, looking at the differences between the male and the female brain and how those react to acetaminophen. What you see is that the male brain is exquisitely sensitive to acetaminophen, more so than the female brain, which could, again, it's circumstantial, but it could be related to why males are more prone to get autism. The ratio is about 4-to-1 compared to the autism prevalence in females. So again, a seventh line of independent evidence, but it's also in laboratory animals, so it's related a little bit to the work that I showed you in line number 6, although they're not separating out so much the difference between males and females. I think one of the most interesting smoking guns in this whole situation is the circumcision connection. So it does turn out that a lot of acetaminophen is given out during the time of circumcision. It's considered the humane thing to do, even though, interestingly, acetaminophen, if you read the Cochrane reports, what should be the standard of care, acetaminophen is not very good, and perhaps not good at all, at blunting pain in small children. It probably does work well for adults with arthritis and some other indications for pain, but certainly, or apparently not in children. But nonetheless, it is given to children on a very regular basis, and especially to males at the time of circumcision. What you find is that the increase in autism associated with circumcision is very significant. Okay, it can be as much as it's 50% increase. So that means if you, and again, it's just comparing circumcised and uncircumcised. Now they're not looking specifically at acetaminophen. So this study is not designed to look at acetaminophen, but there's no other, as far as we know, there's no other plausible explanation for this observation. So that's why it's considered circumstantial evidence. Why should circumcision cause an increase in autism? The consensus right now is that it's not the pain of the procedure that is doing it. There's some interesting circumstantial epidemiological observations. For example, groups that don't use acetaminophen or tend not to use acetaminophen, they do ritual circumcision, they tend to have less autism than groups that do. Again, there's the study is published there. The Israelis have looked at this extensively. There's right now no plausible explanation for this, except for the idea that if you go to the hospital and have the circumcision done there, you're much more likely to be exposed to acetaminophen. Circumstantial, but again, no other explanation. So when you put all of these, and now we're on the 8th line of evidence, only 4 more to go, and then that will be the end of this presentation. There are some otherwise unexplained epidemiological issues. You see on the web, there's this business about in Cuba where they have not had access to acetaminophen. The autism rate is apparently very, very low, but that would be incredibly strong evidence if it was confirmed, but that hasn't been confirmed. That's speculative right now, but based on all available information, we don't think they have very much acetaminophen there. That would be a very good study to conduct to see how much autism versus acetaminophen they have in Cuba. And in South Korea, where they have one of the highest incidents of autism in the planet, they've also had issues with acetaminophen production for children and getting too much active ingredient into the product. And those references are here. This is not a science reference. This is a business journal reference here. Everything else that I'm showing you is essentially in the scientific literature. So it's a 9th line of independent evidence, is these sort of circumstantial, what's going on. There must be some explanation for this, and the point is that it's all fitting into the same picture. Now, in point number 10, this is going to be a little bit controversial, and that's, it's okay. Sometimes science is controversial. Right now, about 50% of all parents who have children with autism are convinced that it's the vaccines that their child received had something to do with the onset of autism. And what we believe is that because acetaminophen was used in conjunction with immunizations for a long time, especially throughout the 90s and even today. I'm very familiar with well-known hospitals where the pediatricians recommend this. So we think that the regressive autism can be induced by the acetaminophen. The parents are not suspecting that it is acetaminophen because they think that should be helpful, not harmful, so they blame the vaccines. Now, the idea here is that with 50% of the parents blaming the vaccines, I think it's an important observation, and we as scientists need to take the parents' observations extremely seriously. In the past, every time scientists have disregarded the observations of parents, they've gotten into trouble. And that has to do, the refrigerator mother hypothesis. I'm not going to go into details of this, but the point is the observations of parents are extremely important, and I think they're telling us what's going on here. I think it's related to this acetaminophen issue here, and I've blacked out trade names. That's not the point of this lecture. I've given you a series of references down here. One of those references is the first 2008 paper where Stephen Schultz looked at the effect of vaccines with and without acetaminophen. He found out if you have a vaccine and a strong reaction to that vaccine and you take acetaminophen, then you're at extreme risk for autism, whereas if you take a vaccine and have a severe reaction or any reaction at all, but don't take acetaminophen, then you're not at risk for developing autism. That was, of course, regressive autism. And then there's some other papers down here. Some of these will be surprising if you go to look them up, because it says, well, there's a risk of this or that for autism. But for example, the bottom line here is that unvaccinated people still have about 1% autism. It's not the vaccine, but again, we want to take the parents' observations seriously and understand what that means, what's really going on there. And again, we believe that it has to do with this process here of Westernization, getting us accustomed to giving a pharmaceutical drug for any kind of medical condition, even one that's not dangerous, not realizing how potentially harmful those drugs might be. And in some cases, in this case in particular, they've just not been tested, so we don't know. Now, we do want to take a step back and look at our model, and in our review paper, again, it's open access, you can do that. You can take a step back and read the entire paper. It's 32 pages long. It's an extensive publication. But in that paper, we develop a hypothesis that accounts, I think, for all of these observations. And importantly, not everyone who gets exposed to acetaminophen has some kind of neurological deficit. We believe what's going on here is that there's two elements required, and one of those is something called oxidative stress. If there's too much inflammation, the immune system is out of control, the body can't keep up, you can get oxidative stress. If there's too much toxins dumped in, you can bypass the immune system to an extent and you just go directly to oxidative stress, but then of course that will subsequently cause inflammation. So inflammation, oxidative stress go hand in hand. We think that that is a key element, in addition to the acetaminophen, to induce autism spectrum disorder, and it's probably mostly after birth. If you look at those data from the first slide I showed you, those 12 studies, I think that most autism is induced after birth. If you, say, took 10 children with autism in a line, one of them would be induced during pregnancy, and 7, 8.5 would be induced after birth by acetaminophen. We're just guessing. We don't know right now. It's a very educated guess, but this is what our best estimate is. Let's say a scientific working hypothesis is what we have now, and those are the numbers that we would estimate. So there's a lot of reasons why we think that after birth it's probably more toxic or more dangerous than before birth. And I've showed you some of that information already. The big change in medical practice started in the early 1980s, that involved exposure after birth. That they didn't change so much the exposure before birth. And we do know that there's roughly a 10% increase in autism with acetaminophen use during pregnancy. We're looking for something that causes a much bigger change than that. Sorry. And going back to those original studies, as I said, the exposure before birth doesn't seem to be nearly as damaging as exposure after birth. And studies in animal models, which I've shown you, point to after birth. That's when they're doing studies with the animal models. And I'll point out that in those animal models, they're not giving those animals inflammation before the acetaminophen. So I think if they would give them inflammation and then give them the acetaminophen, put them under oxidative stress, then give them the acetaminophen, they would probably end up with a much more profound effect. But even without the inflammation, they're still getting a substantial effect, especially in the males. And then some of the circumstantial evidence I've shown you applies only after birth. For example, the effects of circumcision, the observations of the parents with vaccines, that's pretty much after birth effects. So all of this is pointing to after birth. Back to our model, and this is point number 11 of independent evidence, we know that a lot of different issues that children can have that cause oxidative stress are associated with autism. So that's why we think that oxidative stress is an important ingredient in what's going on with kids. But it turns out that one big exception, apparently, as far as we can tell, in our review paper in Journal of International Medical Research, we talk about this, is the notable exception, as far as we can tell, is that while you look at the literature here, you'll see lots of literature on connecting these things with autism, but with cystic fibrosis, you see nothing. There's nothing in the literature. I've talked with clinicians who see patients, that's what they do for a living, is see patients with CF, and they don't have any information about autism. They just haven't seen it, despite the fact that cystic fibrosis is associated with oxidative stress. Now, importantly, and this is why we put this as piece of evidence number 11, patients with cystic fibrosis metabolize acetaminophen much better than even normal people, and far, far better than people that are under oxidative stress. So and we write about this in our paper. There's mechanistic reasons why people with cystic fibrosis have a different kind of oxidative stress, which allows them to metabolize acetaminophen much better. And then the final line of evidence that I'll show you is basically, we think of acetaminophen as anti-inflammatory, but it's not. It is immunosuppressive. It suppresses part of the immune system, and in doing that, it induces an inflammatory response that we can measure in healthy adults. And there's the reference for that if you're interested in reading that. The bottom line is this is something that's very deceptive, I think, that has distracted us as we think of these drugs as truly anti-inflammatory. Reducing stress, exercising, eating a healthy diet, those are anti-inflammatory. This is immunosuppressive. It's fundamentally different than anti-inflammatory. And that's not necessarily the jargon that is presented to the public with marketing with these kinds of drugs. There is a dissenting view, but interestingly, it doesn't address acetaminophen. If you go try to find in the literature anything saying that acetaminophen is safe, you will be very hard-pressed to find anything. I was unable to find anything, and the researchers that we're working with didn't find anything. The only studies that were done as far as safety goes only are looking at a very short time frame. They're looking, because of the nature of Reye syndrome and aspirin, they were looking at does acetaminophen cause bleeding? Does it cause liver damage in children? And the answer is no. The baby's livers don't metabolize acetaminophen that quickly, and we think that's in large part why it's so dangerous for the brain. It can't metabolize it enough to cause liver damage, but it's metabolizing it slowly, leading to a different kind of damage to the human body, in this case specifically affecting the brain. So there's nothing out there that says that acetaminophen is safe for the developing brain. But there is information out there that says there is no epidemic of autism. So this is published. Seldom in the scientific literature do you see the word truth, but there are many people who are absolutely convinced that there is no epidemic of autism, it's not on the rise, and that in fact in this same paper that there are many reasons why it looks like the prevalence of autism is going up, but it's not really going up. All right. Now, Cindy Nevison and I and others have looked at this, and we do not think that this argument is valid, frankly. But this is our opinion. And one way to prove this opinion, and we write about this in this paper, one way to prove whether the opinion is correct or whether the dissenting view is correct is to run the test and see if we take acetaminophen away, will the rate of autism drop precipitously? And we believe that's what should be done. The experiment in the United States would cost less than raising 2 to 3 children with autism. So it's a trivial experiment to do in terms of potential benefit to cost ratio. So again, we don't think there's any credibility to the assertion that there's no epidemic, but it's our opinion. It can't be proven. A couple of arguments have been made. The author of the previous paper has written an entire book on this topic, and one of the arguments I found most interesting was this argument about fetal alcohol syndrome only being discovered in the 1970s. So argument goes further to say, since we know that people historically for the last 10,000 years, from many different cultures, have been using alcohol, and therefore fetal alcohol syndrome must have been in existence, since it was not discovered until the 1970s, that means whatever was going on in the pediatric practice before the modern era just wasn't very good. They were not observant, something was wrong, they weren't paying attention. But it turns out that fetal alcohol syndrome requires inflammation, and inflammation is on the rise in modern society for a number of reasons, which it's subject to my research. Why is inflammation on the rise? If you take laboratory animals and you give them and you reduce inflammation using pharmaceuticals, you will block fetal alcohol syndrome. So it's probably the alcohol itself in conjunction with something else causing inflammation that is inducing fetal alcohol syndrome, which explains why, despite the fact that there's volumes and volumes of work describing pediatric disease prior to the 1970s, fetal alcohol syndrome was not described as such, being associated with drinking alcohol consumption during pregnancy. Another argument that's been made is autism is apparently just a part of the human condition, and that in fact, people with autism may have had some types of autism. So that's glossed over a bit. There's some types of autism is a spectrum, as you know. There are not just one type of autism. But some types of autism may have provided an advantage to people in hunter-gatherer societies. And of course, our argument on this is that there's no evidence that a traditional neurotypical, which means without autism, a neurotypical hunter-gatherer could not have accomplished all the tasks, fishing, making spear points, hunting, planting crops later on after the agricultural revolution. There's no evidence that they were not perfectly efficient at this. And furthermore, it's hard to imagine how these basic social interactions, which are not just common to humans, they're common to all mammals, how those could be aberrant, or they could be fundamentally derailed, and that provides some kind of benefit. It probably did not require did not give people a substantial benefit. And in fact, many people working with children who have autism know they require a lot of extra work sometimes to help them. So we don't think that there's any validity to any of these arguments that there's no epidemic to autism. But again, that's our opinion on the topic. It's not proven. I'm not here to give any medical advice, and the reason I'm putting up this slide is just to point out that before the modern era, people used other methods to reduce fevers when they needed to be reduced. Now this is from the American Academy of Pediatrics, so it's approved by the AAP. It is supported by the makers of acetaminophen for children, but it does describe in some detail how to reduce a fever without using pharmacological means, and in fact even when to treat a fever and when not to treat a fever. But again, this presentation, the information I'm giving you, is for the sake of people knowing what's going on with the research, not to give medical advice, not to tell people what they should do with their children. In fact, the only way to do that is to see a pediatrician here, as recommended on the healthychildren.org website. And of course, your pediatrician may need to be educated about this topic. It turns out, not a pediatrician's job to know the latest research. It is their job to wait until the information comes from an official organization, and then they implement that information. So that is what they are paid to do. It's in some cases not go well for them if they do otherwise. All right, so they do need to implement whatever the current recommendations are. But again, it's important for people to be educated about what's going on. I have a lot of people to thank for this. The co-authors on the paper here from Harvard, Duke, I mentioned Cindy's name several times. She's the one who's really studied the epidemiology for us and looked at the numbers. There's different ways you can track the time course of the epidemic of autism, looking at specific ages through time versus looking at the same age over time, and calculating what percent is due to changing diagnostic criteria and changing awareness and so forth, and specific governmental acts that provide more money for services. And then there's a number of people that we consulted with that helped us look at these different bits of circumstantial evidence. Stephen Ellison is head right now of the Autism Research Institute, and was very helpful to us in looking at that very early data. He's been working on this for almost 40 years. And then several investigators working with cystic fibrosis, and Jeffrey Baker, who looks at autism, and then Susanna Meza-Keuthen, who has been a tremendous help with this, including a lot of technical support in making this video. And thank you very much.